Good evening, dear friends. I'm glad you found your way here tonight. Perhaps you're listening with a cup of tea at your side, or resting already with the lights dimmed low. However you've arrived, you are most welcome. Tonight's story drifts back to another age, a time when households gleamed with polished silver and quiet voices. Yet behind lace curtains, there were struggles not often spoken of. It is the tale of women and families, of longing for calm, and of the bottles of soothing medicine that promised rest but carried shadows in their glass. Before we begin, let me invite you, if you enjoy these gentle journeys through history, to tap the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments below where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always find it comforting to imagine this circle of listeners stretching across cities and countrysides, sharing in the same quiet hour. Now, if you like, you may ease back in your chair, perhaps open the window a crack for the night breeze, or listen to the soft hum of a fan or the imagined crackle of a hearth. Let the world grow hushed around you, and together we'll step softly into part 1. Beneath the gentle murmur of society, there stirred only a quiet wish to feel steady again. It began, as so many evenings did, with silence more eloquent than words. In parlors warmed by coal fires, in drawing rooms where the ticking of the mantel clock was the only sound, women sat quietly, their hands folded in their laps. A visitor might have thought them serene, lost in some pleasant reflection. Yet within, beneath the corseted stillness, was a longing as delicate as the quiver of a candle flame, the wish for calm, unbroken calm. One might imagine Mrs. Charlotte seated by her window at dusk. The glass carried the reflection of her own face superimposed upon the fading garden beyond, roses now only pale smudges against the gathering dark. On the little table beside her rested a bottle, its cork sealed tightly, its label written in a doctor's careful hand. She touched it as one might a talisman, knowing relief could be summoned with but a few drops. Yet she did not lift it, not yet, for she wanted, more than anything, to be the kind of woman who did not need it at all. Across town, another house glowed with similar lamplight. There, a mother bent to kiss her child goodnight, her lips warm upon a forehead, though her mind was elsewhere, on the cabinet drawer, where another small vial lay waiting. She whispered prayers, both for the child's dreams and for her own sleeplessness to be quieted when the house fell still. And in a dozen other homes, the same tableau repeated itself. Gentlewomen who had all the appearance of comfort and plenty nursed secret tremors of spirit. In the hush of respectable neighborhoods, desires were modest, not for wealth nor grand romance, but for a night without the racing pulse, a day without the heaviness pressing upon the chest. What is striking, when we look back, is how ordinary it seemed at the time. A sip of medicine was considered no more remarkable than a spoon of sugar in tea. Doctors spoke reassuringly, neighbors never questioned. And so, a generation of women carried their struggles quietly, each believing herself alone in the wish for steadiness. It was not the storms that undid them, but the stillness, the hours when the household slept and every sound was magnified. The faint creak of the stair, the wind nudging the eaves, the relentless tick of the clock reminding them that dawn was far away. Many whispered to themselves that if they could only steady their hearts, only hush their thoughts, they would be as capable and cheerful as they appeared by day. Yet, within that longing, there was tenderness too. A woman might fold a letter from a sister, hold it against her chest, and draw comfort from the thought that somewhere else, another heart surely stirred with the same yearning. It was a quiet wish, yes, but it would echo through households, through marriages and friendships, until it shaped an entire society's hidden story. Daily life moved in soft rhythms. Teacups, fabrics, footsteps, each sound small enough to soothe, yet large enough to hold secrets. Morning in the Victorian household did not begin with clamor. It began instead with the muted shuffle of servants, the faint strike of the clock in the hall, the sigh of coals being stirred back into glow. Curtains were drawn back to let in a narrow stream of gray light, and the city outside seemed to yawn awake as if reluctant to stir. In such hours, one might believe all was well, that life was nothing more than a chain of ordinary tasks, polished and repeated until they gleamed like silver on the sideboard. Mrs. Whitmore, for instance, rose each morning to the ritual of her tea service. She would descend the carpeted stairs, fingers gliding along the banister polished smooth by years of care, and find the parlor already prepared. A tray waited, porcelain cups thin as eggshells, sugar in a glass bowl, the faint curl of steam rising from the kettle. She would sit, adjust the folds of her wrapper, and listen to the measured sound of the spoon circling the cup. The sound was almost hypnotic, as though the world itself had decided to move at the pace of that stirring. Her neighbors might have said she lived a charmed life, a respectable home, a husband whose business ventures afforded comfort, a circle of friends who exchanged visits and small tokens of affection. And yet, as she lifted the cup to her lips, there was a subtle tightening in her chest, a whisper that ordinary rhythms could not hush. The tea calmed the hands, yes, but not the pulse beneath. It was in such spaces, half quiet, half fretful, that the chemist's shop became a sanctuary. To step into one was to enter a world that smelled faintly of lavender water, camphor, and leather bindings. Shelves lined with bottles stood in polite rows, each one carefully labeled, each one suggesting the promise of relief. For the respectable woman, the chemist was not merely a merchant. He was a confidant, a keeper of secrets, a figure who would never raise his brows at the frequency of her purchases. Imagine Mrs. Davies, another woman of standing, who called at the apothecary once every fortnight. She would speak softly, explaining that the headaches had grown worse, or that the nerves had not settled since the last season's troubles. The chemist, with practiced discretion, would nod, reach for a brown bottle, measure out the fluid with a glass spoon, and hand it across the counter. Payment exchanged, nothing more was said. Mrs. Davies would step back onto the street, the weight of the small package heavier in her gloved hand than the silver she had given for it. What kept such routines from alarming anyone was their utter ordinariness. Just as one purchased flour for bread or coal for the hearth, so too one purchased a cordial for the nerves. It belonged to the rhythm of life, accepted without suspicion. The servants dusted the mantel, the children played in the garden, and the lady of the house managed her letters, her accounts, her small charities. All seemed proper. Yet behind the lace curtain of each window, bottles multiplied quietly. Evening offered its own music. Lamps were trimmed, their glow softening the shadows in every corner. A family might gather for supper, the father reading aloud from the paper, the mother smiling dutifully, while the children recited lessons. But once the dishes were cleared and the house grew still, another rhythm began. The careful turning of a key in a locked drawer, the measured pouring of liquid into a glass, the pause to listen whether anyone stirred upstairs. This, too, became routine, as natural as the chiming of the clock. It was, in truth, the silence between tasks that unsettled most. While the broom moved across the floor, while the sewing needle darted in and out, The mind was occupied. But when the chores were done, when the parlor was tidied and the letters answered, the hush seemed to swell. Thoughts pressed in, the heart raced against nothing, and so the rhythm of the day demanded another note, a softer one, a few drops from a bottle, taken with the same familiarity as sugar in tea. What is striking to us, looking back, is how invisible these habits were to the society around them. Neighbors noticed only the polished brass knocker, the well-tended roses, the cheerful bows at church, the inner cadence, the mixture of ordinary tasks and hidden doses remained unseen, cloaked in the respectability of routine. Yet if you stood quietly in one of those homes, you might have noticed small signs. A bottle on a side table, half concealed beneath a folded handkerchief. A woman's glance toward the clock, too frequent to be casual. A maid sent to fetch something from the chemist more often than the household accounts could explain. These were the faint syncopations in the rhythm of daily life, noticeable only if one truly listened. Still, the beauty of the ordinary remained. Even in the midst of such quiet struggles, women cherished the rituals that tethered them to steadiness. The rustle of skirts in a hallway, the scent of bread cooling on a rack, the laughter of children in the garden. Against these gentle backdrops, the small bottles appeared almost harmless, part of the same fabric, tucked neatly into the folds of respectability. This was the paradox of the age. The more polished the surfaces, the more invisible the cracks beneath them. Every polished tea service, every ordered household, masked the quiet unease beating beneath its own rhythm. And so the story moved on, day after day, its pace measured not only by clocks and bells, but by the unseen counting of drops. Respectability smoothed every surface, yet beneath the gleam trembled what no one dared to name. If one were to walk down a row of Victorian townhouses, especially in the well-kept quarters of London or Bath, the impression would be of order and grace. Brass knockers gleamed like small suns on heavy doors. Lace curtains were drawn just so, never a crease out of place. Flower boxes, even in the soot of the city, offered geraniums or trailing ivy. These houses, and the women who presided within them, seemed the embodiment of composure. To be polished in that world was not merely desirable, it was essential. Appearances were the fabric from which society wove its judgments. A woman might feel her heart galloping in her chest, her thoughts spiraling like autumn leaves caught in a sudden wind. But when the caller was announced, she rose with a smile already arranged. The gown was smoothed, the voice softened, the laughter measured to just the right volume. In those moments, nothing of the storm within reached the surface. Consider Lady Ashworth, often remarked upon for her elegance. Her dinner parties were whispered about with admiration. The silver gleamed, the courses arrived in precise order, the conversation flowed with charm. And yet, her maid, who had brushed her hair before the guests arrived, had seen the trembling hands, the way Lady Ashworth had steadied herself on the dressing table. A small sip from a dark bottle had preceded her radiant entrance down the stairs. To her guests, she was poise incarnate. To herself, she was balancing on a knife's edge. Such stories were not rare. They were repeated in countless variations across drawing rooms and parlors. Society applauded Polish, but it demanded it at any cost. If a woman faltered, if her smile cracked, if her composure slipped, whispers would follow her like shadows. Better, then, to practice the art of masking. Better to hide the bottles among the perfume vials, to fold the secret into the same drawer where gloves were kept. The irony was, that the very polish which concealed the trouble also made it more dangerous. The better a woman appeared, the less likely anyone was to ask how she truly fared. Compliments served as shields. "She looks so well," neighbors would murmur. "Her complexion so fresh, her manner so serene." And with every such word, the silence around her deepened. There was a certain performance to it all. A caller might arrive on a damp afternoon, and the lady of the house would rise gracefully, her voice gentle as she offered tea. She would comment on the weather, inquire about the health of relatives, and keep her smile at the perfect angle. The caller would leave thinking of her as the very image of feminine calm. Yet once the door closed, the smile would collapse, and she would press her palms to her temples, the ache unbearable. Only then, in the privacy of her room, would she reach for the bottle hidden behind the lace sachets. The servants knew more than they ever said. A housemaid, dusting the mantel, might notice the faint aroma of medicine lingering in the air. A butler, carrying trays, might see the mistress pause mid-step, hand gripping the banister until the dizziness passed. But loyalty and propriety kept them silent. To speak aloud what was observed would be to betray the household itself. Thus the performance went on, unchallenged. There were husbands, too, respectable men, who chose not to look closely. If their wives appeared pale, they attributed it to delicate nerves. If accounts showed odd discrepancies, extra shillings unaccounted for, they assumed frivolous purchases of ribbons or trinkets. It was easier, far easier, to maintain the belief that all was well, that their polished wives were simply in need of rest, not of rescue. And so appearances became a kind of armor. The polished exterior was not simply vanity, it was survival. To be anything less than composed was to invite gossip, to risk exclusion from the fragile networks of respectability that defined a woman's world. In such a climate, secrecy did not feel deceitful. It felt protective. What makes the reflection poignant, in hindsight, is the small gestures that carried such weight. A ribbon adjusted twice, though it already lay straight. A letter folded and refolded before being sealed. A pause at the mirror, longer than necessary, as though the reflection might betray more than the face. These were the tremors beneath the surface, almost imperceptible, yet for those who lived them, impossible to ignore. The gleam of respectability lulled society into complacency. As long as silver shone, gowns rustled, and smiles appeared on cue. No one asked about the shadows behind the curtains. It is this quiet, this unquestioned faith in Polish, that allowed suffering to nestle so comfortably in the corners of Victorian households. In the evening, when the lamps were lit and visitors had gone, women often lingered before mirrors. They studied their reflections, wondering which face was the truer one. The polished mask shown to the world, or the tired eyes gazing back at them. Some whispered a prayer for strength. Others reached once again for the small bottle, as though it alone could sustain the appearance required of them. Respectability demanded composure, and composure, for many, demanded secrecy. The more polished the surface, the deeper the silence beneath. Bottles promised peace, their labels written in careful hands, yet inside waited both comfort and quiet peril. In the Victorian age, medicine was a language of reassurance. The apothecary's shop stood at the corner of most streets, its window crowded with jars of colored glass, powders and tonics catching the afternoon sun. A passerby might see bottles with neat labels: tincture of opium, elixir for the nerves, restorative drops, and feel comforted as though answers to all discomforts lay within arm's reach. For women especially, the prescription carried more than medicine. It carried permission. In an age when their complaints were often dismissed as hysteria or delicate nerves, to be handed a bottle was to be granted acknowledgement that the suffering was real. The physician's neat script became a seal of validation, a sign that what they felt had a remedy, and that remedy came measured, respectable, even blessed by science. Picture a physician, his waistcoat immaculate, his tone calm. He sat at a walnut desk, his pen scratching across paper. "For sleep," he would say, handing over the slip. "For your nerves. A drop here, a drop there. Nothing to worry about." The patient, often a wife or a daughter of good family, would leave with a sense of relief already stirring, long before the cork had been pulled. The bottles themselves became quiet companions. Some were squat, with dark glass to shield their contents from light. Others were elegant, almost ornamental, with embossed lettering and golden labels. They were kept close, in bedside drawers, in handbags, even carried discreetly to social gatherings. A woman might tuck one into the folds of her reticule, just as another might carry a vinaigrette of smelling salts. To possess it was to hold a promise of steadiness at any moment. The ritual of dosing was as precise as tea-making. A spoon was laid out, the cork removed with a soft pop, the liquid poured carefully. Some diluted it in water, others let it rest directly on the tongue, bitter as it was. The relief came quickly, the racing pulse slowed, the mind softened, the tremors eased. And with each use, the conviction grew stronger. This was not indulgence, but prescription, advice given by a man of learning, trusted by society itself. Families accepted it without question. A husband, seeing his wife calmer after a restless night, was grateful for the physician's wisdom. Children, noticing their mother less fretful, assumed she was healing. Servants, instructed to fetch more from the chemist, carried out the errand without comment. The act was woven into daily life, so gently that it hardly drew attention. What went unseen was the subtle shift from remedy to reliance. At first, a few drops sufficed for sleepless nights. Then a larger measure was needed to quiet the nerves before company arrived. Soon, the day itself seemed too sharp, too relentless, without the familiar comfort of the bottle. And yet, who could question it? When each dose bore the physician's handwriting, each cork carried the weight of medical authority. The trust placed in doctors was profound. They were men of learning in an age when medical knowledge was cloaked in mystery. Patients did not ask about ingredients. They did not press for details. To do so might have seemed impertinent, even disrespectful. Better, always, to trust. And so the bottles multiplied across households, each one with its own story, its own quiet role in the rhythm of life. Some women even took pride in the medicines they used. To speak of one's tonic was to join a subtle circle, to acknowledge shared experiences without saying too much. At tea, a lady might confess to her friend, "My physician has prescribed me a restorative, so effective." The friend would nod, smile knowingly, and perhaps offer her own account. The bottles, though silent, created a kind of fellowship, a hidden web of women bound by prescribed relief. And yet, not all felt entirely at ease. There were moments when doubt flickered, when a woman, standing alone in her room, might study the bottle in her hand and wonder if she was too quick to reach for it. The bitter taste lingered longer than expected. The relief felt oddly necessary rather than optional. But such doubts were hushed as quickly as they arose. After all, the physician had prescribed it. The label bore his signature. What danger could there be in that? It is easy, with hindsight, to see the peril. But at the time, it was hidden in plain sight, wrapped in glass and paper, softened by ritual. Prescriptions were not chains. They were comforts, until the comfort became indispensable, and the chain was forged without a sound. In different homes, the same hush thickened the air, unspoken yet shared like the night itself. Silence, in those years, was more than the absence of sound. It was a kind of fabric, woven tightly across drawing rooms, kitchens, and nurseries, binding together households that outwardly seemed separate, yet inwardly carried the same concealed weight. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, dense with what was left unsaid. Imagine the row of terraced houses in London, their windows glowing faintly with lamplight as dusk descended. Each doorway led to a different family, a different rhythm of supper and evening rituals. Yet behind those doors, women sat in parlor chairs or at bedside tables, each of them holding the same quiet longing, each of them reaching for bottles that looked remarkably alike. Though they never spoke of it, though society offered no language for it, they were joined by the hush itself, a silence they all carried. Mrs. Harper, in one such house, pressed her hand against her temple. The day had been long, the children's lessons, the endless small negotiations with servants, the letters she must write by morning. She sat by the fire, listening to the faint pop of coal, and thought of the bottle in her drawer upstairs. She would not call it a habit, not even to herself. It was, after all, prescribed. But she felt the silence between the crackle of the fire and the ticking of the clock grow wider, deeper, until it seemed to press upon her chest. She rose quietly, careful not to wake her husband, and went to fetch it. At the very same hour across the city, Lady Pembroke sat in her boudoir, the curtains drawn. She had declined supper, pleading fatigue. On her dressing table lay combs, powders, a folded handkerchief embroidered with her initials. Among them rested a bottle of cordial, its label half worn from use. She held it gently, almost reverently, as though it were both enemy and friend. Outside her window, the rain tapped against the glass. Inside, the silence hummed with what could not be spoken. In still smaller homes, cottages at the city's edge, the same silence persisted, though shaped by different circumstances. A young mother named Ellen, her husband away on night shift at the docks, sat with her child asleep in a cradle by the fire. She had been given a small vial by a kindly neighbor. "For the nerves," the woman had said. Ellen had hesitated, but the sleepless nights had grown unbearable. She tipped a drop onto her tongue and listened as her heartbeat slowed. The silence of her cottage deepened, but no longer frightened her. In that hush, she felt briefly at peace. The remarkable thing is how these silences mirrored one another, though the women themselves might never meet. A baroness in silk, a seamstress in worn wool. Each sat alone in a quiet room, each carrying the same unvoiced burden. They were bound not by words, but by the absence of them. In churches, too, the silence was visible. Women knelt in pews, heads bowed, lips moving in prayer. The prayers were often for health, for strength, for rest. Ministers spoke of patience, of fortitude. No one named the bottles tucked into reticules, the doses taken before stepping out the door. Respectability demanded that the silence remain unbroken, that suffering be hidden beneath the sheen of devotion. And so the silence followed even into sanctuaries, cloaked in the fragrance of wax candles and hymns sung softly. It was not only women who maintained it. Husbands, brothers, even physicians colluded in the quiet. To speak openly of addiction was to invite scandal, to fracture the delicate image of control. A husband might notice his wife's absence at dinner, or the unusual drowsiness that overtook her during visits. But he said nothing. A doctor might suspect that a patient was taking more than prescribed, yet he reassured rather than confronted. Silence was safer. Silence preserved appearances. And yet, beneath the hush, a strange kind of fellowship existed. Though the women never gathered to confess, they recognized one another in subtle glances. At a tea gathering, one might notice another's trembling hand, the faint glaze in her eyes, and look away with sympathy rather than judgment. At funerals, when obituaries spoke of nervous exhaustion or a long illness borne with fortitude, women stood shoulder to shoulder, hearing the truth behind the words. They did not speak it, but they understood. This unspoken solidarity softened the loneliness even as it perpetuated it. To know that one was not alone, even without acknowledgement, was a quiet comfort. But the silence, protective as it seemed, also ensured that no help came. For how could help be offered when the problem was never named? The silence was not merely external. It worked its way inward, into the hearts of the women themselves. They silenced their own doubts, their own fears, insisting that everything was proper, that nothing was amiss. They reminded themselves that their mothers had endured similar trials, that society expected patience, that their duty was to bear quietly whatever came. Silence became habit, as familiar as the ticking of the clock or the rustle of a skirt. And yet, the silence had its own sound, a sound only they could hear. It was the sound of bottles being unstoppered late at night, of liquid poured into spoons, of a breath released in relief. It was the hush after a dose, when the world seemed to soften, when the heartbeat slowed and the mind stilled. That sound, repeated in countless homes, created a kind of hidden music, and though no one named it, though no one dared to, it bound them together across the city, across classes, across lives, across parlors and kitchens. Stories unfolded like reflections in still water, each life a quiet echo of another. When we look back upon the old cities of the 19th century, what strikes us is not only the grandeur of their architecture or the bustle of their streets, but the repetition of private lives. Behind the tall facades, in rooms shaded by heavy curtains, the patterns of experience repeated themselves with remarkable similarity. Women who never met, who lived miles apart, seemed to move along parallel paths, as though their steps had been measured by the same unseen hand. Consider for a moment Mrs. Lydia Harcourt. She was the daughter of a clergyman, raised with a stern sense of duty and a love of poetry. After marrying into a merchant family, she found herself surrounded by social obligations that left her restless. A kindly physician, noting her complaints of sleeplessness, prescribed her a cordial. Lydia took to it with gratitude, remarking in her diary that it soothed the unrest of the night. Yet her words soon shifted from gratitude to dependence. The cordial became less a remedy than a companion, a steady presence that carried her through long afternoons of calling and long nights of solitude. Far away in a northern industrial town, Margaret Tate lived a very different life. She was no clergyman's daughter, but the wife of a mill worker. Her days were filled with clatter and coal smoke, with washing and mending until her fingers cracked. Yet in her small kitchen, she too kept a bottle close, given by a neighbor who swore by its power to quiet the nerves. It became Margaret's relief from weariness that words could not voice. She hid it in the cupboard beside the flour, and when her husband asked why the money stretched thin, she smiled faintly and said nothing. Two women of different worlds, one writing in a diary bound in calfskin, the other hiding a bottle behind a sack of meal, yet their lives moved in echo. Each believed her situation unique, yet each walked a parallel path. The silence of her struggle reflected quietly in the other. In another town, Miss Emily Grafton, unmarried and caring for an aging mother, found herself drawn to the same solution. Her friends praised her devotion, her tireless service, but they did not see the small vial she carried in her reticule, nor the way she counted drops with trembling fingers when no one was near. Emily had no husband, no children, and so her silence was deeper still. Yet she too joined the hidden chorus of lives shaped by the same quiet dependency. These echoes extended beyond the boundaries of class, profession, or circumstance. The widow in her darkened house, the young bride overwhelmed by expectation, the shopkeeper's wife, the governess, all found themselves drawn into the same rhythm. In each life, there was a moment of gratitude for the physician's wisdom, a season of relief when the medicine seemed almost miraculous, and then slowly, the dawning realization that the relief had become indispensable. It is one of history's quiet ironies that while these women might never have spoken openly to one another, their experiences formed a shared pattern so precise that it feels almost like harmony. Their diaries, when we read them now, carry the same phrases. For my nerves, for exhaustion, the only rest I know. Their neighbors described them with the same words: delicate, sensitive, refined. And their families faced the same bewilderment when the bills mounted, when the bottles multiplied, when the once vivacious wife or mother seemed to fade into shadows. Sometimes the echoes became visible in public. At a church luncheon, one lady might falter in her speech, her words slurring slightly, her hand gripping the table edge. Across the room, another woman would recognize the look, the faint glaze of the eyes, the nervous gesture. No words were exchanged, but in that instant, two lives mirrored one another, and both women knew. At funerals, too, the echoes resounded. A neighbor's obituary would mention nervous collapse, and women reading the notice would feel a quiet pang, sensing the truth without ever naming it. Even within families, the reflection spread. A daughter might notice her mother's reliance on a cordial, and years later find herself repeating the same ritual, uncorking her own vial in secret. Patterns passed silently from one generation to the next, not through instruction, but through imitation, absorbed like the scent of lavender in linens. The echo was not only across society, but across time. The men of the era, whether husbands or doctors, often failed to see these patterns. To them, each case was isolated. A wife's troubles were her own, not part of a greater tide. A patient's reliance was singular, not mirrored by countless others. The echo, though audible to us now, was muffled then by the walls of each home, by the polite reticence of drawing rooms, by the unwillingness of society to draw lines between private sorrows. And yet, it is in these echoes that we glimpse the true scale of the epidemic. The repetition tells us that this was no isolated weakness, no rare misfortune, but a shared condition woven into the fabric of Victorian life. Each woman's story, read alone, might appear as a solitary tragedy. Read together, they form a chorus, quiet yet undeniable. There is something strangely tender in that recognition. For while the silence left them isolated, the echo reveals that they were never truly alone. Their lives reflected one another in ways they could not see, their struggles resonating across streets and parishes, across classes and generations. The echo did not bring them comfort in their time, but it offers us understanding now, a gentle reminder that even in solitude, human experience often moves in unison. Sometimes the gentlest kindness, a word, a hand, a presence, proved more healing than any bottle. In every age, there are those who, without intending it, carry a key that unlocks something within the weary. In the Victorian world, where silence and secrecy pressed so heavily upon households, such keys were often hidden in the most unassuming of gestures. A neighbor's visit, a maid's quiet devotion, a friend's listening ear. Consider Mrs. Eleanor Gray, who had for years depended upon her cordial. She spoke little of it, though her family noticed her frequent retirements to her chamber. What steadied her most, however, was not always the medicine itself, but the kindness of her sister-in-law, who would sit beside her without pressing questions. They might speak of roses in the garden, or of a hymn half forgotten from childhood. Those conversations, gentle and unhurried, gave Eleanor a rare sense of peace. The bottle remained near, yet for those moments she found herself needing it less. So often it was companionship that softened the edges of dependence. A maid, perhaps, who tidied a dressing table and lingered a moment to ask, "Would you care for tea, madam?" The words were simple, yet behind them lay recognition. The servant knew more than she said, but chose compassion over judgment. That kindness, however small, became a key, unlocking trust, offering the faintest relief from loneliness. There were also physicians, though fewer than one might hope, who saw beyond symptoms and prescriptions. One Dr. Wentworth, remembered in parish records, was said to spend more time listening than writing. He would walk with his patients in the garden, asking not only about sleep or pain, but about memories, family, hopes. His treatment was no more advanced than his colleagues, but his manner carried gentleness. Several women noted in letters that a conversation with Dr. Wentworth left them lighter, calmer, as though they had been seen not merely as patients, but as human beings. His presence itself was a kindly key. Sometimes the key appeared in unexpected hands. Young children, with their innocence, often opened doors their mothers could not. A boy might climb into his mother's lap, pressing his head against her shoulder, murmuring some half-formed tale of his day. The mother, weary and shadowed by her dependence, would feel for a moment the world grow softer. The medicine was forgotten. The child's laughter carried her through the evening. She might reach for the bottle later, but in that interval, the key had turned, unlocking something tender that even opium could not supply. Church communities, too, offered glimpses of these keys. A visiting lady from the parish might call upon a neighbor, bringing broth or a loaf of bread. Though she never spoke of medicines or ailments, her act itself carried light. In a time when silence and secrecy deepened the burden, such gestures reminded women that care existed beyond the walls of their rooms. Even if the cordial remained, even if dependence continued, the kindness lightened its weight. There were those who, quite literally, held the keys of life and death. Attendants in asylums, nurses in infirmaries. Their choices could harden or soften the fate of those in their charge. A nurse who spoke gently, who adjusted a blanket or offered water with patience, might grant more comfort than all the bottles lining the shelves. To women accustomed to judgment and suspicion, such mercy felt like sunlight through narrow windows. And in homes, among family, kindness often appeared when least expected. A husband, baffled though he might be by his wife's condition, sometimes chose patience over rebuke. He would sit quietly by her chair, reading aloud from a newspaper, pretending not to notice the tremor in her hand. His words, steady and familiar, created a shelter in which she could rest. These were not cures. They were moments, fleeting, fragile, but they mattered deeply. We may think of them now as keys that never quite unlocked the door fully, but opened it just enough to let in air. To women who lived under the pressure of silence and dependence, such breaths of fresh air were precious beyond measure. One diary records a simple note. Today, Mary came and sat with me. She did not speak of my illness. She spoke of roses. I felt better for it, that is all. No mention of medicine, no lament of suffering, only gratitude for presence. Yet it speaks volumes. It is easy in history to focus on tragedy, on the bottles and the overdoses, on the funerals disguised as victories. But woven through are these quieter moments, reminders that compassion was never absent. Even in an age bound by silence, kindness slipped through cracks like lamplight beneath a door. Sometimes the hush of a drawing room concealed not rest, but the fragile pause before collapse. It was often in the most ordinary hours, an afternoon tea, a luncheon, a parish meeting, that the fragile scaffolding of silence gave way. A woman who had carefully measured her doses, who had trained herself to appear composed before others, would suddenly find the balance faltering. In those moments, the quiet itself broke, not with violence, but with the unsettling sound of everything slipping into view. One such afternoon took place in the hall of St. Margaret's Parish, where ladies had gathered for a luncheon meant to raise funds for an orphanage. The tables were adorned with white linens and roses, the air filled with the pleasant murmur of polite conversation. Among the speakers was Mrs. Clara Willoughby, known for her gracious manner and tireless support of charitable causes. She had prepared her remarks with care, rehearsing them aloud in the privacy of her chamber. To steady her nerves, she had taken a dose of her cordial, just enough, she believed, to ease her trembling hands. She rose at the appointed time, her voice clear, her presence composed. For a few minutes, her words flowed smoothly. She spoke of the plight of children, of the duty of Christian households to extend their care. The audience listened with affection, nodding in sympathy. Then, slowly, the cadence of her speech began to shift. A phrase repeated, a pause stretched too long. Her hand clutched the edge of the lectern as though for balance. At first, the listeners thought she was overcome with emotion. They leaned forward, concerned, ready to murmur encouragement. But as Clara repeated an entire sentence, her voice thickened by slurred syllables, a silence fell across the room. The rustle of dresses ceased. The clink of teacups stilled. All that could be heard was the awkward halting of a woman who had, moments earlier, seemed so composed. She tried to continue, her cheeks flushing, her eyes clouded with confusion. Then, before anyone could move to her side, she swayed and collapsed against the table. China rattled, roses toppled, tea spilled across linen. A gasp rose from the assembly. Two women hurried forward, one catching her wrist, another pressing a handkerchief to her damp brow. "A fainting spell," someone whispered quickly, as though naming it otherwise would invite scandal. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken recognition. Many in that room had bottles of their own tucked into reticules or drawers. They knew the look of clouded eyes, the tremor of an unsteady hand. They knew, though none would say it, that Clara's collapse was not merely fatigue. Yet in that hush, they chose the safer explanation. "Nervous exhaustion," they repeated, nodding firmly, creating a shield of words to protect her, to protect themselves. Later, in her home, Clara lay in bed, pale and humiliated. Her husband sat nearby, newspaper folded, brow furrowed. "You must take better care," he said softly, as though the matter were simple rest. The physician, when summoned, prescribed yet more soothing drops. The circle closed again, silence repaired, appearances mended, the break quietly stitched back into the fabric of life. This scene was not unique. Similar moments echoed across drawing rooms and parlors. A hostess who excused herself abruptly from supper, leaving guests puzzled. A governess found asleep at her desk, ink spilled across half-corrected papers. A bride who, during her own reception, disappeared upstairs and returned glassy-eyed, yet smiling faintly. Each instance was explained away: faintness, fatigue, a touch of nerves. Yet behind each explanation lay the same fragile truth. The quiet break was never loud, never violent. It arrived like a crack in porcelain, sudden but subtle, a flaw that could no longer be hidden. Society, skilled in preserving surfaces, rushed to smooth it over. Yet the women themselves carried the weight of these moments long after the hush had resumed. Diaries tell us of the shame that followed. One entry reads, "I fear I revealed too much today. They must have noticed. I pray they think it only weakness, not what it truly is." Another, "I tried to speak, but the words ran away from me. Oh, if only I had measured more carefully." Such lines show us that the women knew, with painful clarity, how near the surface their dependence had crept. And yet, even in collapse, there was rarely blame cast upon them. The culture of the time framed such breaks as evidence of delicate constitution, of feminine fragility. A woman who fainted was pitied, not condemned. In that paradox lay both protection and peril. Her secret remained intact, but the cause remained unchallenged. The quiet break thus became a part of the pattern itself, a moment when truth flickered into view, seen and not seen, acknowledged and denied in the same breath. It was a climax of sorts, but a muted one, the soundless shattering of a silence that quickly wove itself together again. Beneath soft words and polished rituals lay truths too heavy to name, yet impossible to hide forever. Victorian society was skilled at storytelling. It told tales not only in novels and sermons, but also in daily life, in the ways families explained absence, in the euphemisms written into obituaries, in the careful phrases whispered at garden gates. Yet, like all stories, these had their limits. Sooner or later, the truth pressed through, stark and undeniable, even if only in private moments. Consider the house of Lady Margaret Thornton. To neighbors, she was the picture of refinement, her charities praised in the paper, her composure admired at gatherings. When she passed away, the notice spoke of a long struggle borne with Christian patience. At the funeral, her body was arranged with care, her face touched with powder to conceal the marks of strain. A minister spoke movingly of her gentle endurance. Yet among the belongings gathered afterward, her maid discovered not only letters of despair, but bottles enough to fill an entire chest. The stark truth lay hidden beneath the hymns and eulogies. This was not uncommon. Again and again, funerals transformed stark realities into softened tales. Death from overdose became exhaustion. Collapse under dependence was called a wasting illness. The public story was tender, respectable, but the private evidence whispered something harsher. Families found corked bottles in bedside tables, scribbled notes in drawers, unexplained debts in ledgers. They faced the truth alone, behind curtains drawn tight. The stark truth also revealed itself in finances. Entire fortunes were quietly drained by the steady purchase of medicines. Servants' wages went unpaid. Shops extended credit far too long. Estates shrank without clear reason. When accounts were finally examined, families were stunned by the sums spent on tonics and elixirs. To admit it publicly would have meant disgrace, so once more, silence covered the truth. Yet the arithmetic remained, sharp as any headline, telling its story without mercy. In banks and law offices, clerks noticed the patterns. Letters arrived from women explaining unusual withdrawals, repairs that never happened, charities that did not exist, illnesses no doctor could confirm. The bankers processed the requests without challenge, their files slowly filling with polite deceptions. Within those ledgers lay a stark record of dependence, hidden but enduring. Today, those archives read like a parallel history, each entry a quiet testimony. For the women themselves, the stark truth was often felt in the body before it was named in words, a tremor that no glove could fully conceal, a sallow complexion, resistant to powders, a mind once sharp, now clouded with confusion. In diaries, one hears the despair. I fear I am no longer myself. The medicine I thought a friend has made me its prisoner. These lines strip away the polite phrases, leaving only raw recognition. And yet, alongside this recognition came shame. To confess openly was almost impossible. Society had no room for such truths. They threatened its carefully constructed image of feminine virtue. Thus, women bore the knowledge silently, even as it hollowed their lives. The truth, though stark, remained hidden in the quiet spaces between what was said and what was lived. Occasionally, the truth forced itself into public view through scandal. A minister's wife caught embezzling funds to pay for her medicine. A young debutante fainting so dramatically at a ball that rumors spread beyond repair. Court records show cases of theft, forgery, even abandonment tied to women whose dependence had driven them beyond silence. In those rare moments, the stark truth could not be disguised, yet even then society preferred to treat the matter as isolated weakness rather than systemic failure. The wider pattern remained unspoken. What makes these truths so haunting is how they coexisted with gentleness. A woman might spend her afternoon reading poetry to her children, her voice warm, her manner kind. Yet later that evening, she would lock her door and reach for the bottle that made such moments possible. Both realities were true. The tenderness and the dependence, the love and the despair. Life was never one thing only. It was both at once, beautiful and broken. The stark truth, when seen from our distance, is not only a record of tragedy, but also a mirror of human vulnerability. These women were not reckless or weak. They were responding to the tools and understanding their age provided. They sought relief where they were told it could be found. The fault lay not only in their choices, but in the silence of a culture unwilling to question its own comforts. And so, history leaves us with a paradox. On the one hand, the obituaries, the sermons, the memorial stones, all polished, gentle, affirming. On the other, the diaries, the debts, the bottles hidden away, raw, unvarnished, undeniable. Between them lies the space where real life unfolded, where women carried burdens unseen and told stories unheard. That, perhaps, is the starkest truth of all. Beneath polished desks and tidy ledgers, quiet sums revealed stories no family dared to tell aloud. Money, in the Victorian world, was not only a measure of prosperity, but also of reputation. A household's honor could be read in the shine of its silver, the number of servants in its employ, the quality of gowns worn to a ball. But what could not be read, what remained hidden even from the proudest facade, were the small, steady sums siphoned away to keep bottles filled. Behind the carved doors of mahogany desks, in drawers locked with brass keys, lay accounts that whispered of something more than groceries and gowns. A few shillings here, a pound there, slipped toward the apothecary. At first, it was unremarkable, hardly noticed against the backdrop of household expense. But like the slow drip of water, the habit hollowed even the sturdiest stone. The Blackwood family offers one telling example. Respectable, comfortably wealthy, they hosted dinners with polished silver and maintained a staff of 8. To guests, nothing seemed amiss. Yet the books told another tale. Lady Blackwood's purchases of laudanum, recorded under household necessities, grew steadily until they exceeded the wages of all the servants combined. Her husband, assuming the entries to be misfiled, scolded the bookkeeper. But the sums continued to grow. By the time he realized mortgages had been taken, investments liquidated, debts mounting, the family's fortune was quietly bleeding away, not from extravagance in gowns or carriages, but from bottles corked in secrecy. Such stories multiplied across England. Some were whispered in banking halls, where clerks noticed the same women appearing again and again, withdrawing modest sums that never matched the rhythm of ordinary life. A woman might explain, with calm dignity, that her cousin had fallen ill, or that she had promised a charitable donation. The clerks recorded the transactions without protest, but they noticed the tremor of hands, the faint glaze of eyes. In their ledgers, the truth was written in numbers, though never spoken aloud. Private bankers, serving the wealthiest families, kept entire files of such correspondence. Letters arrived in delicate script, explaining why yet another withdrawal was needed. Some spoke of fictitious home repairs, others of imaginary journeys abroad. One lady wrote urgently of a sudden expense for her children's schooling, though her children had long since grown. The bankers, bound by discretion, complied. Yet their drawers filled with these quiet deceptions, a paper record of dependence that would outlive both the clients and their secrets. For families of more modest means, the strain was harsher still. A seamstress, her income already stretched thin, might pawn a brooch or a silver spoon to afford her restorative. Children grew accustomed to suppers of bread and broth, unaware that the money once spent on meat now went to the chemist. Husbands, puzzled by dwindling wages, sometimes assumed frivolity or poor management. Rarely did they guess that the missing coins went to the same bottle their neighbors quietly relied upon. The ripple spread outward. Creditors, patient at first, grew insistent. Servants went unpaid. Tradesmen withheld goods. Schools pressed for overdue fees. In letters preserved from the time, one can read the desperation of women trying to juggle appearances with reality. Pray extend the bill until next month, as unforeseen illness has strained our accounts. The illnesses, of course, were real enough, but the cause could not be named. Even estates crumbled under the hidden weight. A family might seem prosperous, its gardens neatly kept, its children well dressed. Yet within the study, the master of the house bent over figures that refused to balance. "It is the times," he muttered, blaming the economy, the markets, foreign competition. Rarely did he suspect that the true drain lay closer, bottles hidden in drawers, payments marked innocuously in the ledger as miscellaneous. For the women themselves, the ledger was more than financial. It was personal. They calculated doses as carefully as bankers calculated sums. A drop too few brought trembling and unrest. A drop too many, a fog too heavy to lift. Their bodies became ledgers of another kind, recording debts not in pounds, but in sleepless nights, in fading strength, in moments of shame. Occasionally, the truth came fully to light. After a death, families discovered stacks of receipts from chemists, letters requesting extended credit, even foreign bank drafts tied to discreet suppliers abroad. Executors of estates, expecting to untangle investments and inheritances, instead found themselves unraveling years of quiet financial erosion. More than one family, upon settling debts, realized their inheritance had been swallowed by medicine. And yet, society rarely spoke of this openly. To admit that fortune had been undone by addiction was to invite disgrace. Safer, always, to blame difficult markets or bad investments. Thus, the ledgers themselves became silent witnesses, holding the truth without judgment, waiting for historians to read what contemporaries could not say. When we study those numbers today, we hear faint echoes of lives once lived. Each sum, each entry tells a story of a woman's desperation, of a family's denial, of a society's unwillingness to face what lay beneath its polished surface. They remind us that history is not only written in speeches and monuments, but also in columns of ink, in arithmetic that silently recorded the cost of comfort. Amid polished counters and hushed voices, the banks became keepers of secrets too delicate for daylight. The banking halls of Victorian England were built to inspire trust. Marble floors gleamed beneath gaslight. Polished brass railings guided clients toward clerks seated behind oak counters, and the air itself seemed to carry a kind of solemn assurance. Here, fortunes were guarded, inheritances settled, accounts kept in precise order. Yet, within these halls, amid the rustle of ledgers and the scratch of quills, another story quietly unfolded. A story written not in speeches, but in whispers. Women, often dressed in sober black or tasteful gray, appeared at the counters with envelopes in hand. Some arrived in carriages, their gloves immaculate. Others came on foot, their shawls plain but neat. They spoke softly, requesting modest sums. A few pounds withdrawn here, a small draft signed there. Always there was a reason, an unexpected expense, a charitable obligation, a family need. The clerks nodded politely, made the entries, and said nothing. Yet behind their courteous expressions, many noticed the patterns. The same names returned again and again. The requests came not once in a season, but weekly, sometimes daily. The amounts, while small, accumulated into figures too large to ignore. A clerk, balancing the books at evening, might raise an eyebrow at the steady trickle. He might even remark to a colleague in a low tone, "Mrs. Ashworth again today, another withdrawal." The colleague would nod, and both would fall silent, for discretion was the unwritten law of the banking hall. Letters, too, played their part. Clients wrote in careful script, explaining unusual requests. A sudden repair is required at the summer house. An unfortunate illness has obliged me to provide assistance to a relative. An unexpected donation is needed for a worthy cause. To outward eyes, these explanations seemed plausible, but to those who handled the accounts, the repetition was striking. Too many sudden repairs, too many ill relatives, too many charitable needs. The bankers read the words, processed the requests, and quietly filed the letters away. In those drawers, now long forgotten, lies a hidden archive of human struggle. Pages yellowed by time, bearing the faint scent of ink and wax, speak more candidly than the clients themselves ever could. They reveal how dependence required not only secrecy at home, but also elaborate performances in public life. Each withdrawal, each fabricated expense, was part of the careful dance of concealment. Bankers, of course, were not fools. Many knew precisely what these transactions implied. They saw the trembling hands, the distracted eyes, the hurried manner of some clients. They heard the faint slur in a voice, the hesitation before a signature. They may not have understood the full medical nature of dependence, but they recognized the signs of distress. Yet the unwritten code of their profession was silence. Protect the client, protect the bank, protect appearances. To question openly would have risked scandal, and scandal was poison in a society built upon reputation. Some banks even developed quiet procedures. If a client arrived clearly impaired, a clerk might discreetly guide her to a side office, ensuring privacy while the transaction was completed. If a signature wavered on the page, a clerk might steady the hand with tactful assistance, later noting in the ledger that the document had been confirmed. In this way, the banks became silent enablers, facilitating the continuation of dependence while keeping the world at bay. It is not fair to judge them too harshly. They were institutions bound by their age, caught between duty and compassion, between knowledge and denial. They could not have dismantled the broader culture of silence. Yet their records, those quiet ledgers, those carefully filed letters, bear witness to the truth. The banks, meant to safeguard wealth, also safeguarded secrets. The atmosphere within these halls must have been remarkable. The shuffle of papers, the muted hum of voices, the ticking of clocks, the occasional clink of coin. Beneath it all, a tension, never spoken, never acknowledged, ran like an undercurrent. For the clerks knew that behind every polite request lay more than arithmetic. They handled not just pounds and shillings, but the weight of lives quietly unraveling. Occasionally, even the walls seemed to listen. The echo of footsteps on marble, the murmur of a client's voice, the low reply of the clerk, all seemed to conspire in the preservation of silence. Whispers might pass between employees after hours, but the truth never left the building. It lingered in the pages of account books, in the careful notations, in the locked drawers of correspondence. From our vantage now, we may see those whispers as fragments of a larger story. Each transaction was an entry in the hidden history of an epidemic. Each polite letter was a plea, each withdrawal a quiet confession. Together, they form a mosaic of dependence that was never acknowledged in public, but that shaped countless private lives. Ink on paper carried polite words, but between the lines lived truths too fragile to name. Victorian society ran on correspondence. Letters were the lifeblood of households and businesses, of friendships and obligations. They carried invitations to dinners, condolences after funerals, requests for loans, and notes of thanks. The daily arrival of the post was a small ceremony. The clatter of hooves outside, the ring at the door, the shuffle of envelopes upon the hall table. Each letter was opened carefully, read by lamplight, and often tied with ribbon to be kept for memory. But among these bundles of folded papers lay a different sort of letter, one written not to invite nor to thank, but to conceal. Women who needed money to support their quiet dependence learned the delicate art of crafting explanations. Their words, written in flowing script, carried tones of dignity and calm. Yet behind each phrase stood desperation. "Dear sir," one might begin, addressing her banker, "I find myself in need of a small sum owing to unexpected household repairs." The letter would proceed with details. A roof tile displaced by a storm, a stove requiring replacement, a gardener needing extra wages. The banker, reading, might suspect that no such repairs existed. Still, he would file the letter away and fulfill the request, knowing both the truth and the necessity of silence. Another letter might speak of charity. "I have pledged to contribute to the orphanage fund," a woman would write, "and must draw upon my account more heavily this month." Such causes were considered admirable, and to question them would have been indelicate. The banker complied, even while the handwriting betrayed a tremor, the words arriving more frequently with each passing season. Perhaps the most poignant were the letters that invoked family needs. "My cousin has taken ill and requires support." "My daughter must have new gowns for the season." "My husband's business demands a contribution I cannot delay." Each reason, respectable in itself, became a veil draped across a reality too painful to state, that the money was not for tiles or charities or cousins, but for bottles. Some letters are preserved still, tucked into archives, their ink faded but legible. They reveal not only the careful fictions, but also the quiet artistry of concealment. Women became adept at striking the perfect tone, firm but polite, urgent but not panicked. They knew their bankers valued discretion, and they relied upon it. Each letter was both a request and a silent pact. "You will not ask, and I will not say." Yet the cost of these deceptions was heavy. To write such letters required not only paper and ink, but also a continual negotiation with conscience. Many women recorded in their diaries the shame they felt after sealing the envelope. "I wrote again today, saying the chimney must be repaired. I despise myself for the falsehood, yet I had no choice." Another lamented, "I invent stories until I can scarcely remember what is true." The letters pile higher than the bottles. The correspondence itself became a mirror of dependence. At first, the letters were infrequent, each one accompanied by genuine embarrassment. But over time, they multiplied. Some women wrote weekly, even daily, until their handwriting grew cramped and hurried. The envelopes bore postmarks from the same address, arriving so steadily that bankers could recognize them by sight before opening. The bankers' replies were brief and neutral. "Your request has been honored. The withdrawal has been made. The draft has been prepared." Rarely did they comment upon the frequency. Silence was part of the transaction. The exchange of letters became a choreography of concealment, performed with ink and paper instead of words spoken aloud. Yet even within the concealment, there were traces of tenderness. Some letters ended with a line of apology. "I regret troubling you again," or a wish for the banker's health. These women clung to civility, even as they bent it to their needs. They wished in some corner of their hearts to remain respectable, to preserve the image of refinement. The letter was not only a deception, it was also a plea for dignity. In households, letters explained away missing funds to husbands as well. A woman might show her husband a receipt, carefully written in her own hand, claiming the cost of lace or curtains. He might glance briefly and nod, preferring not to question further. Thus the act of concealment spread beyond banking halls, weaving itself into domestic life. Paper became the shield between truth and exposure. The poignancy of these letters lies in their fragility. Paper crumbles, ink fades, yet the weight of the words remains. They remind us that dependence did not only consume bodies and fortunes, it consumed honesty, leaving women tangled in fictions they neither desired nor celebrated. Each letter was both protection and prison, protection from exposure, prison from truth. From our vantage now, we can read them with compassion. We see not manipulation, but survival, not mere falsehood, but a desperate attempt to hold together a life already fraying. These women were writing not only to conceal, but also to endure. Their letters are whispers across time, asking us to understand what their world could not allow them to speak. Across seas and telegraph wires, distant hands carried the same quiet bottles into English rooms. The story of Victorian dependence was never confined to one city or even one nation. Like so many currents of the age, it flowed outward across oceans, returning again in forms both familiar and strange. Trade winds, steamships, and telegraph lines linked quiet parlors in England to faraway ports and merchants whose names the women who sipped their cordials would never know. In this way, the private ritual of dosing in a candlelit chamber was tied to the vast machinery of empire. Ships left London crowded with textiles and machinery and returned laden with raw materials, cotton, spices, tea, and, tucked discreetly among them, opium. In the eastern Mediterranean, in India, and in the distant provinces of China, poppy fields bloomed crimson beneath the sun. Harvested, dried, and packed, their resin moved through channels both official and shadowed. Some of it went directly to pharmaceutical companies, destined to be refined into laudanum and tonics. Some moved less openly, carried by captains who knew which ports asked fewer questions. At the London docks, stevedores unloaded crates marked as spices or herbal supplies. Within them, small packages of raw opium were tucked like secrets, destined for apothecaries and private physicians. Few dock workers understood what they handled. Fewer still asked. They were paid to move cargo, not to question its nature. Yet their labor, unnoticed and unremarked, formed part of the chain that placed bottles upon the dressing tables of drawing rooms. Telegraph lines added another layer. By the 1870s, a woman in Manchester or Bath could request a stronger preparation, and within days her banker might wire funds to a supplier in Paris or Vienna. The coded messages, written in terse phrases, traveled faster than letters ever could. The telegraph clerks, tapping out signals on brass keys, often suspected little of their content. Still, the archives of telegraph companies preserve curious strings of words. Shipment urgent, arrive discreetly, quantity as before, invoice separate, repeat last order, confidential. The language, restrained but suggestive, speaks of an international network humming just beneath the surface of respectability. For the women who consumed these medicines, the world beyond their doorstep was often invisible. They knew only the comfort of the drops, the ease that followed a measured spoonful. Yet, unknowingly, they were participants in a global web of cultivation, trade, and finance. The cordial that calmed their nerves might have begun as a seed planted in the soil of Bengal, harvested by laborers under a colonial overseer, shipped across oceans, refined in a factory in Bristol, and sold in a polished bottle with an embossed label. The distance was vast, the ritual intimate. Sometimes dependence itself spurred international maneuvers. Lady Catherine Morrison, remembered in 9 surviving records, developed such a preference for a particular preparation from continental Europe that she arranged elaborate transfers of funds. She told her friends she was investing abroad, a story that shielded her from suspicion. In truth, she was financing steady shipments of her favored medicine. After her death, her executors discovered accounts in 7 different countries, each tied to discrete suppliers. Her papers revealed a map not of investments, but of desperation. The empire's own contradictions played their part. In India, British authorities taxed and encouraged opium cultivation, even as in London, physicians warned of its dangers. Officials who profited from the trade often looked away from its domestic consequences. The result was a moral paradox. Wealth built on poppies abroad helped sustain habits that quietly eroded families at home. The shadows stretched across continents, binding farmers, merchants, sailors, bankers, and housewives into a single chain. And yet, for all its reach, the trade remained cloaked in silence. Publicly, one spoke of textiles, of tea, of spices. Privately, families knew that letters and drafts concealed other arrangements. The concealment was not only personal, it was global. Entire networks thrived in the half-light, sustained by the reluctance of society to look too closely. There is a peculiar softness to this history when told in retrospect. One can imagine the distant fields, the ships gliding through mist, the hum of the telegraph wires. None of it was dramatic to those involved. It was routine, businesslike, matter of fact. And yet, beneath the routine lay lives drawn ever deeper into quiet dependence. The shadows stretched not with malice, but with the steady inevitability of commerce. To read the surviving records now, shipping manifests, telegraph slips, bank drafts, is to glimpse the hidden scaffolding beneath Victorian life. The familiar image of a woman seated at her vanity, spoon in hand, is inseparable from the distant farmer bending over a poppy field, from the clerk tallying cargo in a Mediterranean port, from the telegraph operator tapping out coded words in London. Each, in their own way, contributed to the small act of relief taken in a quiet English room. Across calm harbors and misty channels, ships carried more than tea and silk. Hidden within their holds were quieter cargoes. The sea has always been both a highway and a hiding place. In the 19th century, as steamships began to knit continents more closely together, the oceans carried not only the expected goods of empire, cotton, sugar, tobacco, tea, but also the subtler cargoes that traveled in the shadow of respectability. Among these was opium in its many forms, destined for markets both legal and discreet. And with the trade came a cast of figures whose lives, though little remembered, reveal how the bottles on a lady's dressing table were linked to distant tides and shifting winds. Picture the Thames in early dawn. Fog drapes the water, muffling the sound of oars. Barges slip quietly between moored vessels, and the silhouettes of tall ships loom against the pale sky. Stevedores move like shadows, hoisting crates, rolling barrels, calling to one another in muted tones. To the casual eye, it is all ordinary commerce, cargoes declared, manifests stamped. Yet tucked within those crates, sometimes beneath layers of spices or bolts of fabric, lie smaller packages, resin wrapped in cloth, tinctures sealed in glass. Their destination is not the warehouse or the open market, but the locked cabinet of a chemist or the study of a physician with well-placed clients. The men who carried these loads were not villains of melodrama. Most were sailors or captains simply earning their keep, guided less by conspiracy than by opportunity. A captain might be asked by an apothecary to bring back a few pounds of high-quality Turkish opium for medicinal purposes. Payment was discreet, but generous. A sailor, seeing a chance to supplement his wages, might agree to carry a parcel ashore, hidden in a sack of grain. To them, it was cargo like any other, folded into the endless exchange of goods that defined the empire. Yet others became specialists. There were skippers who learned which ports offered the purest product, which officials could be persuaded to look the other way, which merchants would pay most reliably. They cultivated networks stretching from Smyrna to Bombay, from Alexandria to London. Their names seldom appeared in newspapers. They did not boast of their trade, but their quiet profits furnished homes, retired debts, even supported families who never knew the true source of the income. A Among the records that survive is the name of Captain Andrew Fairfax, who sailed frequently between London and the Levant. Officially, his ships carried spices and silks. Unofficially, tucked within the cargo, was raw opium purchased directly from local suppliers. Fairfax was no desperado. He was described as courteous, even pious, a man who kept a Bible by his bunk. Yet in his correspondence with apothecaries, one sees the calculations of commerce: weights, qualities, preferred ports. His cargoes, unloaded in silence, helped sustain the very medicines that soothed sleepless nights in parlors miles from the sea. Smuggling thrived not only because it was profitable, but also because it was shielded by silence. The customers for these goods were often women of influence, wives of judges, daughters of industrialists, even relatives of officials themselves. Their dependence created protection. Who would dare prosecute a captain whose clientele could summon judges or politicians to their defense? In this way, complicity grew like ivy along the walls of respectability, unseen but binding. And still, the atmosphere of it all was curiously quiet. There were no dramatic chases across waves, no gunfire in the night. Instead, there were whispered agreements in dockside, taverns, handshakes over crates, notes scribbled in margins of shipping manifests. The drama was not of violence but of concealment. The ships slid in and out of harbors, their sails billowing, their engines hissing, while in their holds lay the unremarked cargo that shaped lives in distant drawing rooms. The sea itself seemed complicit. How many bottles began as poppies swaying in an Anatolian breeze, then traveled by mule, by barge, by ship, across waters gray and green, to end upon a mantle in Mayfair? The waves gave no hint. They bore the cargo gently, lapping against hulls, carrying shadows across leagues of distance. To walk the docks in those years was to stand at a crossroads of the world. One might smell tar, fish, coal smoke, and faintly, if close enough, the resinous odor of opium packed in bales. Men with weathered faces passed by, their eyes avoiding questions, their pockets heavier than wages alone could explain. Yet above them, church bells tolled, children played on cobblestones, and respectable families strolled along embankments, unknowing of the commerce drifting just beneath their notice. Occasionally, scandal pierced the hush. A seizure by customs officers might uncover packages hidden in barrels, leading to brief headlines and murmurs of censure. Yet even then, punishments were light, cases quietly dropped, names discreetly omitted. Too many interests, too many reputations, rested upon the continuation of trade. And so, after each brief interruption, the ships sailed again, the smugglers resumed, the cargo flowed. It is a reminder that history is often less about loud upheavals than about quiet continuities. While Parliament debated tariffs and reformers preached temperance, ships were docking nightly, unloading their shadowed goods. While families knelt in prayer or gathered for supper, smugglers were arranging shipments that would, in time, touch those very households. The line between legal trade and illicit smuggling blurred until it scarcely existed, and the tide carried both with equal calm. Now, when we study these records, we see not only the economic machinery, but also the human faces, captains balancing profit with conscience, sailors carrying parcels for wages, chemists ordering supplies for patients, and women waiting in lamplit rooms, unaware of the journey their medicine had taken. The sea connected them all, knitting together lives that never met, making accomplices of the unwitting. Behind polished desks and solemn oaths, physicians walked a narrow path between healing and profit. The figure of the Victorian physician stands in memory like a symbol of authority. Waistcoat buttoned, spectacles gleaming, pen poised above a prescription pad. His presence in the sick room was meant to assure, to quiet anxieties, to bring order to chaos. Families deferred to him, servants hurried at his instruction, and women looked to his words as lifelines. Yet beneath this air of certainty, many doctors of the age carried their own conflicts, torn between duty to patients and the temptations of commerce. Medical science was in transition. Germ theory had not yet been fully accepted. Anesthetics were only beginning to change surgery, and pharmaceuticals were exploding in variety and strength. Physicians were both gatekeepers and customers of a booming industry. They prescribed medicines manufactured by companies in which, not uncommonly, they held shares. They advised restraint publicly, while quietly profiting from the very preparations they criticized. Consider Dr. William Hartwell, a London physician remembered in both journals and gossip. He specialized in nervous complaints, a phrase broad enough to include sleeplessness, fainting spells, melancholy, and 100 other discomforts. He prescribed laudanum liberally, assuring his patients that it was a blessing of modern chemistry. At the same time, he invested heavily in the very firms that produced laudanum in bulk. His financial well-being rose with each bottle he recommended. Was he a healer or a shareholder? The truth, uncomfortable then as now, was that he was both. Journals of the period reveal the contradictions. Articles warned of the dangers of opium, describing its grip upon the body, its toll upon the mind. Yet on the opposite page, advertisements blazed with promises: a miracle cure for the most delicate constitutions, a trusted restorative for ladies of refinement. Physicians who edited those journals allowed the advertisements to run, for they paid the bills that kept the presses turning. Thus, in the very spaces where warnings appeared, enticements stood side by side. Conferences and societies gathered doctors together to discuss best practices. One might imagine sober debate about withdrawal, about alternatives, about restraint. Instead, much of the talk turned toward preparation methods, dosage refinements, and the advantages of new concentrated forms. To advance medicine, they believed, was to make it stronger, purer, more reliable. That such strength multiplied risk was a thought set aside, for the market clamored for novelty, and novelty promised both fame and income. Doctors were not villains. Many were sincerely devoted to their patients, convinced that opium was the best tool available. They saw the relief it brought. A woman who had wept from exhaustion, now able to smile faintly. A patient once racked by pain, now able to rest. To deny such medicine seemed cruel. Yet they also saw, if only dimly, the shadows it cast. Patients requiring larger doses, returning again and again, their once bright eyes clouding. Some physicians noted these changes, scribbling in casebooks, wondering if they ought to reconsider. Others explained them away as progression of illness, unwilling to believe their own prescriptions could be the cause. Conflict appeared even in the doctor's own home. Imagine a physician at supper, his wife remarking that another patient had collapsed in the street. His daughter asking why mother's friend seems so pale. He might stir his soup and remain silent, thinking of the bottles he had signed off that morning. He knew the profits were steady, the practice secure, yet unease lingered like an unwelcome draft. To admit doubt, however, was to risk authority, and authority was the physician's greatest asset. Patients themselves sometimes sensed this conflict. Letters from women to their doctors reveal both trust and quiet reproach. "You have always been kind to me, doctor, and yet I fear the medicine grows heavier than the illness." Another wrote, "I beg you for guidance. Must I truly take more each week?" The replies, preserved in archives, often sound hesitant, as though the doctors wished to reassure yet lacked conviction. Continue as instructed. Your constitution requires it. Such words soothed in the moment, but deepened the long-term snare. The conflicts extended to the broader medical market. Pharmaceutical companies courted physicians with gifts, elegant pamphlets, even trips to continental congresses. A doctor might return from Vienna or Paris carrying samples of new preparations, eager to share their promise with patients. Behind the enthusiasm lay another layer, companies counting on the doctor's reputation to market their wares. In this way, medicine, morality, and money entwined, each tugging upon the other in ways difficult to untangle. Some doctors resisted. Quietly, in back rooms or rural practices, a few counseled restraint, urging their patients to seek rest, gentle exercise, or herbal remedies. They faced ridicule from colleagues who dismissed such measures as old-fashioned. Yet these cautious physicians left fewer records, for they were less celebrated, less quoted in journals. History remembers more readily the bold than the prudent, and so the image of the laudanum prescribing physician endures. To walk through a Victorian surgery would have been to step into this tension. Bottles lined shelves, their labels neatly written. Ledgers of fees lay open on desks. Pamphlets from pharmaceutical firms stacked in corners promised cures in delicate print. And in the midst of it all, a man with pen in hand, balancing compassion against commerce, science against uncertainty, his decisions shaping the lives of those who trusted him absolutely. The conflict was never loudly declared, never printed in headlines. It lived instead in the hush of the consulting room, in the pause before the pen touched paper, in the doctor's gaze as he studied a patient's weary face. To prescribe was to help, and also to bind. To refrain was to seem uncaring, and perhaps to lose a patient's trust. Between these poles lay the quiet struggle of Victorian medicine, a struggle that echoes still in the faded ink of prescriptions tucked into archives, long after both patient and doctor have gone. What began as a few soothing drops soon became stronger, sharper, and more perilous than anyone first imagined. Progress, in the Victorian imagination, often gleamed like a polished mirror. New inventions promised to shorten distances, brighten homes, and ease pains that had long been endured in silence. The railway shrank the countryside, the telegraph quickened speech, and in medicine, the word concentrated carried an almost magical allure. If a little of something worked, surely more of it, distilled, purified, intensified, must work better. It was an age of optimism about chemistry, and within that optimism lay hidden dangers. Laudanum, once dispensed in generous spoons, seemed clumsy beside the innovations arriving from laboratories in Germany and England. Pharmaceutical firms unveiled tinctures reduced to just a few potent drops, promising faster relief, less fuss, and greater discretion. Ladies who once measured doses by the tablespoon could now carry tiny vials, slipping them quietly into reticules or pockets. The convenience was irresistible. A small bottle, barely larger than a thumb, could steady nerves or banish headache without anyone noticing. But within those bottles lurked potency far beyond expectation. A woman accustomed to a certain measure of laudanum might find herself overwhelmed by the same amount of the new concentrate. Her body, trained by habit, misjudged the power. A few drops too many, and the mind drifted into fog deeper than any she had known. A few drops too few, and the claws of withdrawal tore at her nerves. What had seemed an elegant solution became a trap more cunning than the old spoon and glass. Consider the case of Lady Elizabeth Patten, remembered in fragments of letters and newspaper accounts. She had endured headaches for years, the kind that throbbed behind the eyes and made candlelight unbearable. Her physician, Dr. Morrison, recommended the newest German concentrate, praising its purity and strength. She accepted it gratefully, for she longed to be as lively as she once had been, to attend charity functions without wincing at every flicker of light. At first, the medicine seemed miraculous. A few drops steadied her hand, brightened her mood, softened the ache behind her eyes. She could attend luncheons, converse with neighbors, and read her novels once more. But within weeks, the balance shifted. What had calmed her yesterday now left her anxious, even trembling. She increased the dose, then again, until her body demanded amounts that alarmed even her loyal maid. Soon, the medicine's effects swung like a pendulum, over-sedation on one side, hollow agitation on the other. Such stories multiplied, though few reached the newspapers. Families preferred silence, and doctors explained symptoms away as constitutional weakness. Meanwhile, manufacturers pressed forward, marketing each new concentrate with handsome labels and glowing pamphlets. The very qualities that made these medicines appealing, discretion, portability, power, were those that deepened dependence. The stronger the dose, the swifter the descent. Tolerance climbed like ivy on a wall, wrapping tighter with each week. A lady who once carried herself with poise might, within months, struggle to remain awake through a dinner party. Another, desperate to appear cheerful, would take large doses before a social event, only to collapse afterward in private torment. The concentrated medicines turned parlors into quiet theaters of performance, bright smiles, sparkling eyes, and beneath it all, the heavy pulse of addiction. Even physicians, though cloaked in authority, misjudged the danger. They believed purity meant safety, that refinement meant control. In truth, these qualities magnified risk. The line between relief and ruin narrowed until it was scarcely visible. To miss it by a drop was to plunge into despair or stupor. And yet, prescriptions continued, the bottles multiplied, and the advertisements proclaimed ever new marvels. The cultural fascination with strength, stronger steel, faster trains, brighter gaslight, made resistance unlikely. Why cling to the old when the new promised so much? Families, eager for progress, welcomed these concentrated tinctures, proud to display their modernity. Only in private did they begin to notice the cost. A mother's vacant gaze, a sister's trembling hands, a wife's sudden collapse in the midst of polite conversation. There is a strange quiet in such histories, for the concentrated dangers were rarely named aloud. Society preferred to speak of nervous disorders, of delicate constitutions, of long illness borne with fortitude. Yet the records, ledgers of chemists, letters of patients, whispered recollections of servants, tell us plainly what was happening. Stronger medicine did not bring stronger health. It brought fragility masked by momentary ease, followed by decline too swift to halt. And so, in drawing rooms across the country, concentration became a double-edged gift. Families admired the sleek vials, praised their efficiency, and yet trembled when the same medicine turned upon those they loved. The very word, concentrated, whispered promise, but it also whispered peril. When silence at home could no longer hold, the matter sometimes slipped into the courts, where whispered afflictions became public record. The Victorian household prized privacy almost above all things. Curtains drawn, letters sealed, conversations kept within family walls. These were the habits of respectability. Yet even the thickest curtains could not forever conceal the consequences of addiction. Sooner or later, debts piled too high, thefts became too brazen, or scandals too glaring. And when that happened, the matter crossed the threshold into a courtroom where the hush of parlor secrets was broken by the echo of legal voices. Courtrooms of the 19th century were not grand stages in the sense of modern dramas. They were often drafty halls, wood-paneled and stern, where clerks shuffled papers, barristers adjusted wigs, and the public leaned in from benches. Yet for families who had carefully preserved appearances, to stand in such a place was to feel as though one's entire world lay exposed. Words once spoken only in whispers, dependence, intemperance, theft, now rang out clearly, recorded in ink, preserved in files. Take, for instance, the trial of Sarah Mitchell, the minister's wife, whose desperation led her to embezzle church funds. Her story, retold in fragments of newspapers, became a kind of parable of the age. Here was a woman of good standing, known for her charitable works, accused of pilfering coins from collections meant for the poor. To her neighbors it was unthinkable, to the congregation unbearable. And yet the evidence lay plain. Ledgers altered, funds missing, medicine bottles in her chamber far too numerous to explain away. The prosecution painted her as deceitful, a thief cloaked in piety. The defense, more sympathetic, argued that she was unwell, a victim of the very medicines prescribed by trusted doctors. The jury, caught between indignation and pity, delivered a verdict that balanced both. Guilty, but with mercy recommended. The sentence, months in prison followed by a term in a sanitarium, satisfied no one entirely, but it revealed, in stark light, the confusion of a society that did not know whether to punish or to heal. Such cases were not isolated. Records tell of wives forging signatures, daughters pawning family heirlooms, servants discovering caches of bottles and reporting them in panic. When exposed, families scrambled to explain. Some blamed weak nerves, others hinted at hereditary illness, still others insisted the charges were exaggerated. But the court heard facts, not whispers. Missing sums, altered wills, debts unpaid. Lawyers, for their part, became reluctant experts in the subtleties of addiction. They learned to detect patterns in estates drained of funds, to question accounts that showed endless medical expenses. Some even devised quiet strategies to protect surviving family members, shielding them from creditors once the addicted relative had passed. In this way, the law became both a tool of exposure and, at times, a shield against complete ruin. The atmosphere in these trials was often one of uneasy fascination. Spectators craned to hear, knowing that the accused might be someone's neighbor, perhaps even a distant relative. Newspapers printed reports, though delicately, cloaking opium-related cases in phrases like nervous afflictions or melancholy indiscretions. Readers, however, learned to read between the lines. A woman who had succumbed to nervous exhaustion, or a gentleman's wife who had endured a long illness with fortitude, often signaled the presence of laudanum somewhere in the tale. And yet, despite the exposure, most cases dissolved back into silence once verdicts were passed. Families withdrew, reputations bruised, but not shattered beyond repair. The community, uneasy but eager to restore its sense of order, soon looked away. It was easier to treat such cases as unfortunate exceptions than to recognize them as part of a much wider pattern. Still, the court records remain, preserved in neat handwriting in archives that smell faintly of dust and ink. They tell us of women whose trembling hands betrayed them under questioning, of husbands torn between loyalty and shame, of children bewildered by proceedings they could scarcely understand. These documents, unadorned and factual, stand in contrast to the polished obituaries and sanitized funeral sermons. They reveal the raw edges of lives where respectability had frayed. The paradox of these courtroom shadows is that they both exposed and concealed. They laid bare the facts, money taken, documents forged, debts unpaid, but they seldom addressed the root. The bottle on the bedside table, the drops counted out in secrecy, the hunger of the body that overpowered will and reputation alike. Judges spoke of morality, of responsibility, of betrayal. Few spoke of dependence as an illness. And so, while verdicts were rendered, the deeper causes remained unacknowledged, waiting to claim the next victim. One can almost hear the sounds of those rooms, the rustle of silk dresses as women shifted uncomfortably on benches, the tap of a cane on stone floors, the solemn intonation of the judge. The accused would stand, pale, often trembling, her voice barely audible. In that moment, whatever dignity she had preserved in private collapsed under the weight of public scrutiny. Yet even then, many remained loyal to the very medicines that had brought them there, unable to imagine life without the relief they once promised. The courts, in truth, were ill-equipped. They were built to judge theft, fraud, violence, not the gray territory of medical dependence. And so they stumbled, alternating between punishment and sympathy, never settling firmly on either. The result was a patchwork of sentences and precedents, each case both unique and emblematic of a broader silence. Looking back, these courtroom shadows are poignant, not for their drama, but for their restraint. No gavel thundered, no sweeping reforms followed. The trials flickered briefly in public view, then faded, leaving only faint echoes. But for the families involved, they were searing. A minister stripped of trust, a merchant's estate dwindled, a daughter's marriage prospects lost. These were the lasting sentences, unrecorded but deeply felt, not with a cry nor a sudden fall, but with years of slow dimming did many lives come to their quiet end. History often recalls its dramas in flashes, wars declared, treaties signed, monarchs crowned. Yet for the countless women who lived and died in the hush of the 19th century, there was no trumpet blast. Their stories ended softly, as if a lamp burned lower and lower until the flame flickered out. This was the long fade. The gradual decline shaped not by catastrophe, but by the daily measure of drops poured from a small bottle, the steady narrowing of a life. It is perhaps the quietness that makes these stories so haunting. Imagine a lady seated in her chair by the hearth, her embroidery set aside. Once she filled her days with calls upon friends, with letters written in elegant hand, with laughter that carried down corridors. Now the hours pass more slowly. She dozes in the afternoon, struggles to rouse herself for supper, speaks less and less at gatherings until, at last, she ceases to appear at all. To neighbors, it seems a gentle retirement into privacy. Only within the household is the truth known, that each evening's calm depends upon the measured release of medicine from a vial, that her strength wanes not from age alone, but from the steady grip of dependence. Servants were often the quiet witnesses of this decline. A maid might notice how many bottles she carried up to the bedroom, how frequently she was sent to fetch more from the chemist. She might whisper to the cook that Milady seems paler, her appetite less each week. But discretion was part of service. Concern seldom reached beyond kitchen walls. Thus, the decline continued, seen and not spoken of, until it became the family's unremarkable normal. Letters reveal the sadness of relatives who watched such fading. A sister might write, "She is not the companion she once was, though her sweetness remains. We sit together, Yet she speaks little, and her hand trembles so when she pours the tea. Another confessed, "I fear her health fails, though the doctor insists it is only her nerves." We all tiptoe about, hoping to keep her comfortable. There is tenderness in these words, but also helplessness. For what could love do against a medicine prescribed by authority, sanctioned by habit, and wrapped in silence? The long fade seldom announced itself with scandal. There were no sudden collapses at luncheons, no dramatic arrests or court cases. Instead, there was a steady lessening. Fewer outings, more days in bed, the withdrawal from social calendars. Friends learned to excuse absences. Invitations dwindled, then ceased. A woman who once moved gracefully among circles of acquaintances became a name recalled only in reminiscence. She was so lively once. I wonder how she fares. And then, perhaps a notice in the newspaper. After a long illness, born with fortitude, she has departed this life. Behind these words lay a reality far more complicated. The illness was real enough. Sleepless nights, digestive troubles, frailty of the nerves. But its course was shaped, accelerated, and deepened by the very cure meant to ease it. Doctors, convinced they were soothing, continued to prescribe. Families, unwilling to question, continued to supply. And the patient herself, weary of suffering, continued to comply. The fade was not resisted, it was accompanied. What strikes us now is how little resistance there was. In an age that prized endurance, decline was not only accepted, but, in a way, admired. To fade slowly, with patience, seemed almost virtuous. Sermons praised such quiet departures. Obituaries framed them as noble. That the fading was often hastened by the steady drip of a medicine bottle was left unspoken. Silence wrapped the truth as surely as shawls wrapped frail shoulders. And yet, within this pattern, there were flashes of awareness. A diary entry might hint at unease. I wonder if I am more prisoner than patient. I dread the hours between doses, yet fear the medicine itself. Another wrote, I cannot imagine life without it, though I scarce recall life before it. Such words, few and scattered, are the faint voices of those who recognized, even as they faded, that something beyond illness held them fast. The economic toll was part of the fade as well. Estates were drawn thin, not by extravagance but by endless medical bills, by bottles purchased weekly, by consultations charged faithfully. Families adjusted, selling off a carriage, dismissing servants, moving quietly to smaller houses. Each adjustment was explained as prudence, yet beneath it all lay the steady cost of maintaining an illness that never improved. And still, the world outside continued with its noise, trains clattering, factories humming, crowds bustling. Within these larger movements of history, the long fade of individual women barely registered, yet it was there, like an undertone, shaping families, altering fortunes, leaving traces in letters, in accounts, in whispered memories. At the bedside of one such fading woman, a daughter once wrote, "She sleeps more than she wakes." We sit together in silence. I hold her hand, and sometimes she stirs, smiling faintly, as though she recognizes me. But the intervals grow longer. The image is tender, almost peaceful, yet beneath it is a grief unspoken, the loss not only of a mother, but of years stolen by a medicine that dulled rather than healed. The long fade teaches us something essential about history, that decline can be as powerful as crisis, that silence can weigh as heavily as noise. These women, whose names seldom appear in textbooks, carried the burdens of an age that trusted too much in bottles and too little in questions. Their fading was not dramatic, but it was widespread. and in its breadth it shaped households, communities, and, quietly, the course of society. Long after the bottles were emptied, their echoes lingered in the rhythm of daily life. When the physicians left and the medicine bottles were tidied away, the household remained, carrying forward subtle changes that were neither spoken of nor easily named. The long fade of an afflicted mother, sister, or aunt altered not only her own existence, but also the lives of those around her. A house is never only bricks and mortar. It is a pattern of footsteps, a cadence of voices, a network of small rituals. And when one figure faltered, the whole cadence shifted. Imagine the family dining room, once filled with conversation. At first, her absence is excused. She is unwell this evening. She rests upstairs. The chairs still fill. The table is still laid, but the balance tilts. Children whisper more quietly. Servants glance toward the staircase, waiting for sounds that will not come. Weeks pass, and the absences lengthen. The place is set out of habit, then quietly removed when untouched. Soon the chair itself is taken away, and the table shrinks to match the number of regular occupants. Yet in the silence, her presence is still felt, as though she lingers in the air. Domestic staff often bore the burden of adjustment. A lady's maid, once busy arranging gowns and assisting with calls, might find herself instead carrying trays upstairs, tidying a chamber darkened in midday, keeping track of countless small vials. The rhythm of her service changed, narrowing to the orbit of the sick room. Letters once dictated to friends grew shorter, then ceased. The maid, loyal but unacknowledged, became both caretaker and silent witness to a decline few outside the house would ever see. Children, too, absorbed these shifts in ways they could not articulate. They grew accustomed to tiptoeing past certain doors, to the hush that fell over conversations when visitors asked after their mother. They learned early the art of concealment, to say she was resting, to smile and change the subject, to carry on games without expecting her to join. In their memories, the household was defined not by laughter alone, but by a persistent quiet, a caution that shaped their sense of family life. Fathers or husbands shouldered practical burdens. They balanced accounts stretched thin by doctors' fees and chemists' bills, all while maintaining appearances. Some grew irritable under the strain, others withdrawn. Many clung to silence, convinced that discretion was the greater kindness. In social circles, they nodded gravely when others inquired, offering the same stock phrases. She has been delicate, or her nerves trouble her. The truth was too complex, too stigmatized to voice. The ripple effects extended outward. Friends who once visited frequently began to hesitate. Calls were shorter, gifts left at the door rather than delivered in person. The afflicted woman, once central to her circle, became a figure remembered with fondness, yet seen only in glimpses, at a window, in a carriage, at rare moments of strength. And as her presence receded, so too did the bonds that linked the household to its wider community. This was the echo, a family reshaped by absence, a rhythm altered by the steady pull of a medicine bottle. The house continued to function, of course. Meals were served, children grew, seasons passed. But woven into the fabric of daily life was a thread of silence, a knowledge unspoken yet undeniable. The household carried on, but never quite as it had before. What is striking when we look back is how ordinary it all appeared. Neighbors saw only small changes, fewer outings, fewer invitations, a quieter home. The reality that addiction had settled into the very marrow of the household remained hidden. Respectability, that most prized possession, was preserved outwardly, Even as within, the echo of dependence lingered in every corner. What was not spoken often weighed more heavily than what was ever confessed aloud. Silence in the Victorian household was not merely the absence of sound. It was a discipline, a shield, a habit cultivated carefully across years of custom. To keep one's troubles discreet was to guard respectability, and respectability was as vital to survival as bread itself. Thus, when addiction crept into families, it was silence that wrapped itself around the problem, as though by not naming it one might diminish its power. Yet silence, like a heavy cloak, grew heavier the longer it was worn. Consider a parlor in the late afternoon. The curtains are drawn against the glare, the air faint with the scent of lavender. On a small table, a silver bell rests within reach. Upstairs, in her chamber, the lady of the house lies half asleep, her bottle of medicine on the stand beside her. Servants pass quietly, careful to tread softly upon the carpeted stairs. In the dining room below, her husband entertains two acquaintances, speaking with polished courtesy while ignoring the chair left empty at the head of the table. No one asks directly where she is. To do so would be to transgress the unspoken rule. One does not expose private weakness to public scrutiny. Such silences took many forms. There were the omissions in letters, phrases like, "She has been delicate of late," or "Her strength fails her, though her spirits remain good." There were the evasions at social calls, where visitors were offered tea, but not admission upstairs. And there were the quiet instructions to servants, who learned never to discuss their mistress's habits beyond the household walls. Children absorbed these lessons early. When curious schoolmates asked why mother no longer attended church, the practiced answer was, "She grows weary easily." When neighbors wondered about the packages delivered weekly from the chemist, they learned to smile and shrug. The truth, that dependence on medicine shaped the rhythm of every day, was never voiced. To speak it was to invite shame, and shame was a burden more feared than suffering itself. Yet silence did not erase reality. It merely displaced it, pushing it into corners where it grew in weight. Husbands bore the strain in their ledgers, watching household expenses swell inexplicably. Daughters felt it in their hearts, sensing a distance from the mother who once guided them with tenderness, but now drifted behind a veil of drowsiness. Servants carried it in the countless errands to apothecaries, their arms laden with bottles they dared not question. What is striking, reading the letters of the era, is how carefully the silence was maintained even when truth pressed hard upon it. A brother might write to his sister abroad, "She has been confined to her room this winter. The doctor assures us her condition is not alarming." Between the lines, one hears the effort to reassure, to protect reputation, to deny the creeping suspicion that medicine was both sustainer and destroyer. The silence functioned as armor, but armor, when too heavy, weakens the one who wears it. Doctors, too, colluded in this hush. They spoke in euphemisms, nervous complaints, constitutional delicacy, phrases that sounded medical but revealed little. Rarely did they confront the reality of dependence, even when its signs were unmistakable. To acknowledge it would have been to question their own authority, their own prescriptions. So they too chose silence, wrapping their ignorance in the dignity of professional vocabulary. The weight of such silence was felt most keenly at moments of crisis. When a woman collapsed at a dinner table, whispers rushed through the room. Yet even then, explanations avoided the obvious. It was her heart, her nerves, her constitution. Guests accepted these words, grateful for the reassurance, though all had seen the faint bottles tucked discreetly into her reticule. Silence provided cover, but it also prevented action. For how can one confront what one cannot name? There were exceptions, rare and fragile. A daughter might confide to a close friend, her voice trembling, that she feared for her mother. A husband might write in private despair to a brother, confessing that he no longer understood how to help. But such breaches of silence were uncommon, and those who spoke risked being judged themselves, accused of disloyalty or exaggeration. More often, silence prevailed, thick as fog over the household. The cultural weight of this silence extended beyond individual families. Newspapers, when reporting deaths linked to medicine, cloaked them in euphemism. After a long illness, borne with Christian patience, clergy, when preaching funerals, praised fortitude and faith while never naming the true cause. Memorial stones inscribed virtues, not vices. Thus the silence spread outward, reinforcing itself across society. Each family believed itself alone, each household thinking its sorrow unique, when in truth countless others suffered the same. Silence is heavy not because it is empty, but because it carries all that is unspoken. Each omission, each evasive phrase, added to the load borne by those within the household. Over time, this weight-shaped posture, expression, even memory. Children grew into adults who struggled to name their own troubles, repeating the pattern of concealment. Families adjusted their histories, remembering illness but forgetting its cause. And so the silence endured, outlasting the very lives it concealed. When we read today the diaries, letters, and ledgers of that age, the silence is palpable. Gaps in correspondence, sudden changes of subject, abrupt endings to narratives, all reveal what could not be voiced. The historian leans close, listening not only to the words, but to the spaces between them. It is in those spaces that the true story resides, the weight of silence, heavier than grief itself. What fades in one lifetime often lingers quietly in the next, carried not in words, but in habits, silences, and the stories children tell themselves. Memory does not end with a death. It drifts, like perfume clinging to fabric, long after the bottle is empty. In Victorian households touched by addiction, the women themselves may have faded, but traces of their struggles lingered in the children who watched, in the grandchildren who heard half-whispered tales, in the very way families arranged their daily lives for years afterward. Generations remember not always with clarity, but with impressions, tones of voice, fragments of explanation, the absence of presence where once there had been warmth. Picture a boy, perhaps 12, sitting on the steps of his family's townhouse in London. His mother has not come down to supper again. He cannot explain it to his friends at school, but he feels the difference. While their mothers appear at assemblies and host gatherings, his remains upstairs, her footsteps faint in the corridors. He learns to guard this knowledge like a secret, to smile when asked, to invent excuses. Years later, as a grown man, he will find himself uneasy whenever illness is mentioned in polite company, as though the silence of his youth still binds his tongue. Or imagine a girl, just entering her teens, asked to fetch something from her mother's dressing table. She finds the small vials tucked carefully into a drawer, labels neatly written. She does not fully understand their meaning, but she feels a quickened pulse of worry. Her mother's face, pale and distant, lingers in her mind as she replaces the bottles exactly as she found them. That girl may grow into a woman who distrusts medicine altogether, or perhaps one who leans toward it instinctively, remembering without knowing why that bottles were once a source of both comfort and sorrow. Families often reshaped their stories for the sake of the children. Your mother was delicate, a father might say. or "she suffered from her nerves." These phrases carried on into memory, repeated until they hardened into family legend. Rarely was the word addiction spoken. Instead, the memory was softened, blurred, polished like a stone rolled smooth by years of water. Yet beneath that smoothness, children sensed the jagged truth. They grew up with a knowledge more felt than named, that something had gone quietly wrong in the rooms above. The echoes showed themselves in subtle ways. Sons of addicted mothers sometimes drifted toward drinking as young men, almost unconsciously repeating the pattern of self-soothing they had witnessed. Daughters often carried a wary vigilance, watching their own health anxiously, fearful of inheriting the weakness they had been told about. Even grandchildren, though further removed, absorbed the residue. They might hear two sentences, one evening at the fireside. "Your grandmother was a sweet woman, but she was never well." And from those few words, an entire imagination would bloom, painting pictures of a gentle figure always cloaked in fragility. Letters and memoirs from the later Victorian decades reveal how powerfully these impressions endured. A middle-aged man, recalling his childhood, wrote, "My mother was a kind soul, but I cannot remember her laughing. I remember instead the closed doors, the whispered instructions to the servants, and the way my father's eyes clouded when her name was mentioned." Such recollections, written decades after her passing, show how deeply the silence and sorrow were etched into memory. It is important to remember that families did not intend harm by their silence. They believed they were protecting dignity, sparing children pain, preserving respectability. Yet the very hush created confusion. Children grew into adults who carried unanswered questions, shaping their lives around mysteries they could not resolve. And so, the memory of addiction stretched further than the life of any one woman. It became a family legacy, woven into identity itself. Even in cases where the truth was eventually revealed, it arrived softened. A granddaughter might stumble across a diary tucked away, its pages brittle with age, describing doses and cravings in a hand she recognized. The shock would mingle with recognition, confirming what she had long suspected. She might close the book with tears, not only for her grandmother's suffering, but for the generations who had lived in shadow because the truth had been hidden. Generational memory can act like a faint echo in a hallway. One cannot always trace its source, yet it is there, reverberating. The choices people made in later life, their caution with doctors, their attitudes toward illness, their openness or secrecy, all bore traces of the past. Families where addiction had once lived often developed a culture of vigilance, an almost ritualized concern for health. Others veered in the opposite direction, treating every ailment with suspicion, resisting treatment even when needed. Both responses were shaped not by direct experience alone, but by the inherited memory of what silence had cost. As time stretched on, these impressions fused into family lore. At reunions or over holiday meals, a relative might remark, "You know, Aunt Margaret was always rather frail." Another would nod, adding, "She bore her troubles quietly." And with that, the conversation would move on. No one said more. But in that brief exchange, another generation absorbed the idea that women in their family were prone to hidden weakness, that silence was the proper response to suffering. Such was the way memory moved, not in grand declarations, but in soft currents. It did not vanish with the closing of one life. It seeped quietly into the next, shaping character, shaping choices. And so the women who faded slowly in lamplit rooms lived on, not only in photographs or gravestones, but in the posture, the speech, the hesitations of those who followed them. In time, what was whispered behind curtains began, hesitantly, to be spoken aloud by a few brave voices. Societies change not all at once, but in slow ripples. For decades, Victorian England and her sister lands had kept addiction cloaked in silence, hidden in parlors, smoothed over by obituaries. But silence, however thick, is never absolute. Here and there, a voice rose, sometimes in the pulpit, sometimes in the pages of a journal, sometimes in the letters of reformers who could not bear the hidden grief any longer. These voices were small at first, but like the first notes of a song in a still room, they carried farther than one might expect. The pulpit was often the earliest platform. Ministers, seeing congregants weaken year after year, began to question the bottles lined discreetly in so many homes. They seldom named laudanum or morphia directly, preferring instead to preach of over-reliance on worldly remedies. Yet their congregations, listening in the hush of Sunday morning, knew what was meant. Wives lowered their eyes. Husbands shifted uneasily. For the first time, the matter was not only a private sorrow, but a subject touched in public speech. Next came the journals. At first, these were medical periodicals, where cautious physicians dared to write of patients exhibiting dependency. Their language was clinical, their tone restrained. Still, within their case reports, one finds glimmers of recognition that what was once considered merely habit might, in fact, be something deeper, something that altered both body and will. In the margins of such journals, handwritten notes by readers reveal the dawning realization. Doctors who had long prescribed opium, now wondering whether they had unwittingly sown seeds of decline. By the mid-century, newspapers too began to stir. Articles appeared in small corners of local presses. Stories of bankruptcies tied to medical expenses, obituaries worded less delicately, even occasional scandals when thefts or trials could no longer be contained. Editors, cautious not to offend their readership, cloaked their prose in euphemism. Yet the effect was unmistakable. Matters once confined to whispers in parlors now traveled into the breakfast rooms of readers sipping tea over the morning paper. One cannot underestimate the role of women reformers in this shift. Already active in campaigns for temperance, sanitation, and education, they began to notice how many of their sisters suffered quietly from bottles meant to soothe. In drawing room meetings and charitable societies, conversations turned to female health and the dangers of over-medication. Pamphlets were written, small, cheaply printed, often circulated through churches, that warned of the risks of excessive reliance on chemical restoratives. Though mild in tone, they carried the radical implication that silence could no longer be sustained. Not all voices were welcomed. Many reformers were dismissed as meddling, their warnings brushed aside by physicians and husbands alike. Yet even resistance acknowledged the presence of a conversation. The very act of denial proved that the silence had cracked. The subject was in the air, difficult to suppress once spoken aloud. It is moving to read the letters preserved from these years, letters between sisters, between mothers and daughters. In them, one finds tentative acknowledgments. I fear the medicine does me more harm than good, yet I know not how to stop. Or, I have read that others suffer as I do, and I am strangely comforted to learn I am not alone. These private correspondences, emboldened by the faint stir of public discussion, reveal the profound relief that comes simply from naming a thing that has long been hidden. Some journalists took bolder steps. Anonymously, they published exposés of apothecaries who sold without restraint, of doctors who overprescribed. One striking piece in a provincial paper told of a young mother who, having relied upon laudanum through her confinement, could not relinquish it afterward. The article, though sympathetic, shocked readers unused to seeing such matters described so plainly. Letters to the editor followed, some condemning the indecency of printing such details, others thanking the paper for shedding light on an unspoken sorrow. In Parliament itself, the matter flickered briefly. Committees investigating public health mentioned opium in their reports, noting its prevalence among women and the poor alike. Debates remained cautious. Economic interests loomed too large, and officials profited from colonial trade in the very substance they were asked to regulate. Still, the fact that the word appeared in official transcripts marks a turning point. What had been invisible was now, if faintly, inscribed in the record of governance. The cultural effect of these shifting voices was subtle but real. Families began cautiously to share their concerns with trusted friends. A husband might confide in his brother, where once he would have remained silent. A mother might warn her daughter, "Take care with the bottles. They are not harmless." Such warnings, even whispered, represent a break in the chain of secrecy. For the first time, some families acknowledged openly what had long been known in silence, and yet it was not a revolution. Most still clung to discretion. Most deaths were still recorded as long illnesses, but the silence no longer held as firmly. The cracks were visible. Through them, shafts of recognition entered, soft but persistent, lighting the truth in corners, once cloaked. From our vantage, these shifting public voices feel small, almost hesitant. Yet for those who lived within the weight of secrecy, they were profound. To hear in church, or to read in a journal, that others too suffered as they did, was to feel less alone. It was to glimpse the possibility that silence was not inevitable, that the sorrow of one household was part of a larger pattern. That recognition, fragile as it was, carried comfort, and slowly the seed of change. From faint beginnings, reform gathered slowly, leaving behind a legacy that reshaped both medicine and memory. When voices first rose against the hush of addiction, they seemed like fragile threads, easily broken. Yet over time, those threads wove into something more enduring. By the latter decades of the 19th century, reform, halting, imperfect, but genuine, had begun to leave its imprint upon the way society thought about medicine, health, and responsibility. The earliest reforms were modest. Apothecaries in some towns began keeping more detailed records of purchases, a quiet recognition that the bottles passed across their counters carried consequences. Clerks who once handed out laudanum as casually as tea leaves now noted names, quantities, and dates in ledgers. It was not regulation in the modern sense, but it marked a step away from complete anonymity. Families who bought regularly could no longer do so entirely unseen. Medical colleges, too, began to stir. Papers were read aloud at conferences, not merely celebrating new concentrates, but warning of their risks. A physician in Edinburgh, after presenting the case of a woman who had declined into stupor under constant dosing, urged colleagues to consider tapering rather than increasing prescriptions. His plea was met with polite murmurs rather than applause, yet it was printed in the proceedings, and thus carried further. In the quiet way of professional exchange, seeds were sown. Charitable societies, often led by women, took the reform spirit into drawing rooms and chapels. They framed the problem not as vice but as misfortune, deserving compassion. Committees raised funds to support rest homes for afflicted women, places where fresh air, good diet, and spiritual instruction were offered as alternatives to endless medication. These institutions were far from perfect, Discipline was strict and moral judgment heavy, but they represented the first efforts to treat addiction as something to be managed rather than hidden or punished. Legislation followed, though cautiously. By the 1860s and 70s, some regions had passed acts requiring certain opiate preparations to be labeled more clearly. Dosages were recommended, warnings were printed, albeit in small type. These measures seem slight to modern eyes, yet for the time they were radical acknowledgments that medicine could harm as well as heal. The state, which had long profited from opium through imperial trade, now admitted a duty, however small, to protect its own citizens from unguarded consumption. In households, the legacy of reform was felt most keenly in conversation. Where once mothers warned daughters only with silence, now they might add, "Be cautious. The doctors say too much of this medicine is unwise." The shift was subtle but powerful. The unspoken had become, at least partly, speakable. This change in language allowed younger generations to see dependence not as a mysterious weakness, but as a recognized danger. Knowledge, even incomplete, broke the chain of secrecy. One striking legacy lay in literature. Novelists, ever attuned to the currents of society, began weaving addicted characters into their plots. Some were cautionary figures, ladies undone by their nervous remedies, while others were drawn with sympathy, showing the quiet suffering behind closed doors. Readers encountered these stories in serialized magazines, perhaps recognizing their own households in the lines. Fiction thus carried reform into the imagination, making visible what had been hidden. And yet, reform was uneven. In some cities, chemists remained as generous as ever, filling bottles without question. In rural areas, far from oversight, families continued long habits of dosing infants with soothing syrups and women with laudanum tinctures. The legacy of reform was not a sweeping transformation, but a patchwork, stronger in some places, faint in others, always shaped by class, by region, by the stubborn persistence of silence. Still, progress could be measured in the shifting tone of obituaries and sermons. Phrases of euphemism remained, but gradually one sees more direct acknowledgments of illness complicated by dependence on medicines. Ministers, once silent, sometimes preached caution directly, urging congregants to seek health in moderation and natural means rather than in the deceptive promise of bottled relief. These words, heard from pulpits, carried weight. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was a change in perception. Addiction, once seen as shameful weakness, slowly came to be understood as an affliction that could touch even the virtuous. This shift did not erase stigma, but it opened the door to compassion. Families who might once have hidden away an afflicted member began instead to seek treatment, however rudimentary. The afflicted themselves, hearing public acknowledgement of their plight, felt less alone. In hindsight, these reforms look like stepping stones across a wide river. They did not carry society all the way to safety, but they offered footing where before there had been none. From those stones, later generations would walk further, toward modern understandings of dependence, regulation, and care. Today, when we read the pamphlets, the parliamentary reports, the novels, and the private letters, we see the legacies layered upon one another. They tell us that silence can indeed be broken, that small voices can accumulate into change. They remind us, too, that reform is rarely dramatic. It often arrives quietly, like dawn, gradual, gray at first, almost unnoticed until the light is fully upon us. What began as whispers in private drawing rooms slowly pressed outward, until governments themselves could no longer turn away. In the Victorian era, the distance between a parlor and Parliament seemed immense. Parlors were places of lace curtains, soft voices, and unspoken sorrows. Parliament, by contrast, was a hall of law, policy, and public debate. Yet history often shows how private burdens, repeated in thousands of households, eventually gather such weight that they tip the scales of law. So, it was with opium. What began as small bottles hidden in cabinets came, over decades, to shape conversations in committees, votes in chambers, and, eventually, statutes inscribed in the books of government. At first, policymakers spoke of opium only in relation to trade. The empire's profits flowed richly from the poppy fields of India and the markets of China. Colonial revenues depended upon it. Wars had even been fought to secure its flow. To those who guided ships and counted tariffs, opium was an economic engine, not a domestic affliction. Yet beneath their very windows, in the streets of London and Manchester, families bore the cost not in gold, but in grief. The turning point came gradually, through pressure from reformers who refused to let the matter remain private. Letters arrived on ministers' desks from doctors alarmed at the cases they observed. Women's societies sent petitions, their signatures looping across parchment, urging restraint in the sale of poisons. Newspaper articles, once relegated to small columns, grew bolder, reporting scandals and deaths too glaring to ignore. Each document alone might have been overlooked, but together they formed a chorus that Parliament could no longer dismiss. By the 1860s, committees were convened to study the opium question. Their reports make sober reading now. They list cases of infants dosed with soothing syrups, of women bedridden by laudanum, of households ruined by the steady expense. They note with caution the difficulty of balancing compassion for sufferers with the economic interests of trade. Always in the background loomed the contradiction. How could Britain profit abroad from what was destroying its own at home? The first policies were cautious, more symbolic than sweeping. Requirements were introduced for clearer labeling on bottles. Chemists were encouraged, though not always required, to record the names of purchasers. Some preparations were restricted to those with a physician's note. These steps did not end the widespread use of opiates, but they marked the first time the state acknowledged its responsibility to intervene. The parlor had reached into policy. For families, these new rules meant small changes. A husband sent to purchase medicine for his wife might be asked his name, his address. A lady, accustomed to sending a maid to the chemist, might find the errand more complicated. Such inconveniences were resented by some, welcomed by others. Yet even in their modest scope, the regulations carried symbolic weight. The bottle, once unquestioned, was now subject to oversight. The debates in Parliament reveal the unease of the era. Some members spoke passionately of protecting women and children, describing opium as a silent destroyer within homes. Others warned of interfering too far in private life, insisting that families should be free to manage their own health. Economic voices reminded the chamber that Britain's prosperity was bound to opium exports. Each speech carried a fragment of truth, but together they revealed the central tension: compassion versus commerce, freedom versus protection. Outside the halls of government, these policy shifts echoed. Reform societies pointed to them as victories, proof that silence was breaking. Clergy preached that the law now stood on their side in urging caution. Even physicians, once defensive, began to adjust their practices, mindful of the new scrutiny. Slowly, imperceptibly, culture bent toward greater awareness. What is most moving is to imagine the ordinary families who felt these changes not as abstract law, but as lived experience. A widow who had struggled with dependence might find her doctor more reluctant to prescribe. offering instead advice on rest and diet. A father, once accustomed to purchasing soothing syrups for his restless child, might now think twice when confronted with warning labels. In these small hesitations lay the beginnings of new habits, new attitudes. And yet, policy alone could not erase the past. Thousands of women had already slipped into the long fade. Thousands of families had borne the burden of silence. What policy offered was not rescue, but recognition. At last, the affliction had a name in law, a place in regulation, a weight acknowledged by the state. In hindsight, the movement from parlors to policy was inevitable. History shows again and again that what is suffered privately eventually presses outward, demanding public response. The quiet persistence of reformers, the courage of doctors who wrote truth in journals, the grief of families who refused to remain silent, all converged until even Parliament could not turn away. So policy was born, not with thunder, but with murmurs. From the hush of parlors to the echo of Parliament, the long-hidden sorrow of addiction at last entered the ledger of law, marking the first true bridge between private grief and public responsibility.